Alright guys, Buildzoid here, and this is going to be a pretty sleep-deprived but maybe fired off really rapidly video because I've been trying to go to sleep and failing at that for several hours straight, so I've given up and decided to record this disaster of a video that's about to take place. So, I've been thinking about Ryzen 3000 and the X570 chipset, and does the X570 chipset make a lot of sense? Because I don't know of a single X570 motherboard that's cheaper than $150. So if you look at the Ryzen 3, and the thing is, and so, you know, I've been thinking about, well, what does that $150 get you over like a B450 motherboard? And does that, does what the $150, you know, so like $50 extra on top of a B450 board, because I will ignore B450 motherboards that cost less than like 75 because they're terrible at that point. But so if we just consider that, you know, like we take our $150 X570 board and we compare it to like B450 boards, what does this X570 motherboard get us? Well, it gets us, you know, the PCIe 4.0 leadership right here, according to AMD. So this PCIe 4.0 leadership, the thing about that is that if you're going to be doing like a nice min-maxed gaming build, right? So you're going to buy yourself a 3700X, because this, I think, is the performance per dollar sweet spot in terms of the Ryzen CPUs, because let's just like we're going to assume that you're an overclocker because you're watching actually hardcore overclocking. If you're not an overclocker and watching my channel, I don't know what you're doing here. Leave, you dirty casuals. Anyway, yeah. Where was I? 3700X, right. So basically, even if I assume there's a binning difference between the 3800X and the 3700X. If the 3800X on average hits 4.4 gigahertz and a 3700X on average hits 4.2 gigahertz, that's only about 5% performance difference. So I'd still say that doesn't matter. That's not worth 70 quid, right? Or $70, which with how UK pricing works, that's going to be 70 quid. We're going to be paying 30 quid for that and 3.99 quid for that. So it'll be 70 quid by the time it gets here. But I don't think that's worth 70, like 5%, I don't think is worth $70. And that's assuming that that's a 200 megahertz gap and not like a 150 megahertz gap or a 100 megahertz gap. If it's a 100 megahertz gap, it's even less worth it to buy a 3800X over a 3700X. But anyway, so we're doing our little min-max 3700X CPU build. And we're buying the 3700X because this is basically AMD's knockoff 9900K. If the performance charts from AMD are to be believed, this thing with an overclock, like the 3800X with an overclock, like matches a 9900, actually a stock 3800X matches a stock 9900K. So this thing with an overclock should do about the same, right? Match a 9900K. And we all know that a really popular configuration is a 9900K plus a 2080 Ti. And the thing about the 2080 Ti is that it does not saturate it doesn't even really max out with PCIe 3.0 X8, but more importantly, it doesn't support PCIe 4.0. So this right here is completely bloody useless. Like, yes, leadership, but this card does not care about your leadership because it does not support PCIe 4.0. So it only runs on 3.0, therefore having a PCIe 4.0 motherboard is completely bloody useless for our min-max build right here. Now somebody's going to be like, but Buildzoid, Navi supports 4.0. My response to that is Navi is like in the same performance category, like is roughly in the same performance ballpark as a 1080 Ti. It is not fast enough to saturate a PCIe 3.0 X8, much less a 4.0 X16. Who cares, right? Like, Navi's not going to take advantage of it. Maybe next year when we start seeing cards like, I assume there's going to be a 3080 Ti, right? Like, that makes sense. So there's probably going to be a 3080 Ti. There's probably going to be we're probably going to see like a big Navi chip. Those might actually max out a PCIe 3.0 X8. In which case, it might actually have an advantage to run PCIe 4.0 X8, right? Because PCIe 4.0 X8 is about the same bandwidth as X16 3.0, or 3.0 X16. So that would actually, those are cards where that would actually have an advantage, where you can run 4.0 X8, and you basically get the same bandwidth as 3.0 X16. But for cards that are currently available, it just doesn't make any sense because all of the NVIDIA ones don't support it, and Navi isn't fast enough to care, shouldn't be fast enough to care about it, or isn't fast enough that it should care about it, whatever. You get what I'm trying to get at. Basically, PCIe 4.0 does not improve your GPU performance whatsoever. But PCIe 4.0 might be beneficial if you're buying a PCIe 4.0 compatible SSD. The thing is, I don't know anything about high-speed SSDs because I buy my SSDs in SATA because I like my storage cheap and big. So I buy SATA SSDs. So yeah, I don't know anything about like NVMe SSDs. I don't know what kind of real world performance benefits you would get. I would assume you only care about having a 4.0 PCIe SSD if you're like a video editor. Because from what I've heard, the 3.0 SSDs are already so damn fast that it like doesn't even improve your game loading speed or your operating system boot speed, which I don't know. I've never tried them myself, so, but that's what I've been told. And if that's actually the case, then yeah, I'd say, okay, so this is great if you're like a video editor and you want a lot of really fast PCIe SSDs. It's not that great if you're trying to build a min-maxed gaming build, right? Because we're not going to stick a 4.0 SSD in it because that's a waste of our budget. We can go and spend the budget on things like air coolers or better RAM, right? Like, and that brings me or better RAM, but we're not going to cover the RAM right now. What we're going to talk about, what else, is the VRM, because the other thing that X570 significantly improves is the VRMs, and these are obviously all of like the flagship motherboards from all of the different board vendors, but across the board, X570 just offers better VRMs than what you get on like the bottom of the barrel X470 board is a significant downgrade from the bottom of the barrel X570 motherboard. By the time you hit like a $200-ish X570 board, the VRM on those is significantly better than what you get on a $200-ish X470 motherboard. It's crazy how much of a big upgrade there is in the VRM department. So yeah, you get a huge VRM upgrade if you go to X570. But do you actually need such a massive VRM upgrade? Well, if you're buying a 3700X, like I'm saying you probably should if your only care is gaming, or a 3800X for that matter too, because these are basically the same chip, you don't actually need to care about the VRM, because the 3800X and the 3700X, when overclocked, will pull less power than a maxed out 2700X. That's right, these two CPUs need less VRM than their predecessor, which makes perfect sense. These are 8 cores on 7 nanometer. They should be pulling less power for the same amount of performance. That's how that should work. And I'm saying should because recently with the smaller process nodes, what we've been seeing is occasionally the node gets leakier to the extent where you get more performance at maybe more power consumption, or you don't get any extra performance and the power consumption stays the same, or like the clock speed goes to hell and things, get weird. So, because it used to be that new process node, more clock speed, but fun fact, 32 nanometer is like, what was for Intel on 14 nanometer plus basically only got back to the same level of clock speed as what they were doing on 32 nanometer in terms of overclocking. I don't mean out of the box. Out of the box, it's gone way up because it's TDP constrained out of the box, but a 2600K did 5 gigahertz. That was pretty normal. A 7700K did 5 gigahertz several years later. And in between those two chips, there's a bunch of CPUs that on average do not do 5 gigahertz. They do significantly less. And I think the worst of them was Broadwell and Haswell, because Devil's Canyon kind of fixes it. Whatever. We're not going to talk about that right now. It doesn't matter too much. Anyway, yeah, but these will pull less power than the 2700Xs. And I know for a fact, and I don't ask me how I know that, because I'm pretty sure I'm not supposed to know that. But I do know that, and since I do know that, these are going to pull less power than 2700Xs when maxed out, which means you don't need as much of a VRM. So the big advantage of X570's great VRM is not actually useful. Like, yes, the VRM is better, but your CPU is not actually going to pull enough power for that to make a freaking difference. So doesn't matter. And if you're on a 3600X or a 3600, the VRM is literally irrelevant. Like, you can run those off of even a pretty bad 4-phase. These, I'd say a good 4-phase is a good thing to get, but these are who cares? They don't pull in, like, they're 6 cores. They literally pull 25% less power for the same voltage and clock speed as a 3700X or a 3800X, unless they're like exceptionally leaky silicon. And even then, that shouldn't make too much of a difference. Like, they still shouldn't be able to shouldn't be able to bridge that 25% gap just from the lower core count. Anyway, so yeah, VRM on X570, it's great and all, and amazing and incredible, but it doesn't actually help the CPUs that, like the sweet spot CPUs in terms of performance per dollar. So at that point, it's like, okay, so we don't need X570 for the PCIe 4.0. We don't need X570 for the VRM. Do we need X570 for the memory? because X570 does like make some pretty significant changes to the memory support in terms of the motherboards. The motherboards are now better at memory overclocking. Some of that's going to be, I'm not sure how much of that is like BIOS upgrades, how much of that is the new memory controller, how much of that is PCB layout optimizations. I don't know. But what I do know is that if you're not going for anything, like the thing is, if you want to run your CPU in one-to-one mode, according to AMD right here, you're probably going to top out around sort of 3733 to 3600-ish megahertz, right? And the thing about 3600-ish megahertz is that you can do 3600 megahertz on trash. And when I say, well, okay, that's not entirely true. Like what I consider a solid B450 motherboard is what I mean by that. Nope, that's not the right link. This can do 3600. This right here. It's like, or at least when this was still available, it was under $100. This can do 3600 megahertz. There's a bunch of other, there's a whole bunch of motherboards from MSI that'll do 3600, no problem, on AM4, on the B450 chipset, X470 chipset, like whatever chipset you want, you can do 3600. Because the thing is, 3600 megahertz, like for Ryzen people, that sounds like a very high speed. It's not a very high speed. The main problem with Ryzen first gen and second gen memory overclocking is Ryzen itself. And to some extent, there were some motherboards here and there that were absolutely bloody god awful. To the point that one of them literally got like, there was a motherboard that literally just got straight up, actually two motherboards from one of the board vendors that got completely canceled because the memory layout on them was just so screwed up that they were, I think those boards were literally stuck at 2933. Like there was no way you were ever getting them past that because they were literally broken at the design phase, like in the design stage. But since then, the boards have gotten significantly better, and there's a lot of motherboards out there on like B450 and X470 that'll do 3600 megahertz just fine if your memory controller of your if the memory controller of the CPU of your CPU is capable of doing that. So if we assume that the main upgrade, like, so you know, if the memory controller on all of these is significantly better, then and you're still only aiming for 3600 to 3733 megahertz, then you don't need X570. You just don't. And so at that point, it's just like other boards that would do 3600. This does 3600. That does 3600. This does 3600. This is my preferred X470 memory testing motherboard because it's so easy to work with. It's actually very similar to working with this, except this has a better VRM. I'm pretty sure that's why I use that instead of that, is this has a much better VRM. Anyway. And not for the memory, for the actual CPU. But anyway. Firefox? Oh, there we go. So, yeah, it's just like, so the VRM doesn't matter. The memory layout, you know, unless you're buying, like that's the thing, unless you're buying these super high-speed memory kits, the memory layout shouldn't really affect you that much. 3600 megahertz should be doable on any halfway decent daisy chain motherboard. And speaking of halfway decent daisy chain motherboard, I should have pulled up the Asus product. Oh no, I'm not going to the website from Asus. It's terrible. But like the X470 Prime Pro does 3600 megahertz. The X470 Strix-F, the X470-F Strix, whatever, you get the idea. That board also does 3600 just fine. So yeah, there's a ton of options from a bunch of board vendors where it's just like, yeah, those boards do 3600 megahertz, no problem. That's not an issue. And 3733 would also work on them if the bloody memory controllers had been better, right? And actually, some lucky CPUs do 3733 on those boards. So it's kind of that, you know, just that's worth keeping in mind. So for the lower memory speeds, the board doesn't matter too much. Now, if you were going over, say, 4000 or 4266, that's when the boards start to matter a lot. And at that point, I'd say yes. X570 might actually be a great idea if you're planning on pushing some stupid high memory speed in excess of 4000 or 4266 megahertz. The thing about that point is also, you're going to have, like, you know, unless you're doing manual overclocking, you're going to be buying a very expensive memory kit. And I don't think you're probably not one of those people that cares about saving, you know, $70 on their CPU and then $50 on their motherboard and then a bunch of money on their memory kit. Like, you know, at that point, it's like if you're aiming for these kinds of memory speeds, you're also not aiming to be cost effective. At that point, I'd say you're not aiming to be cost effective. I'd also say, considering this chart right here, it might be a good idea to wait for some performance reviews to come out about the memory scaling, because there's a good chance that you might just never be able to regain the performance gap from the reduced Infinity Fabric speed that comes up here. So, you know, like that's also something to keep in mind. So, yeah, that's kind of that. With the X570 motherboards, what I've basically been thinking is just, yeah, the whole thing doesn't really make a lot of sense if you're just trying to build like a really cost-effective gaming system, because like motherboard, like if you want to run, like you'll notice a like the big difference between the motherboards for memory speed will be on expensive high-speed memory kits, or if you're extremely committed to doing a lot of overclocking on your memory, because you can actually like if you buy like a bunch of Micron E-die, that'll actually relatively easily do 4266 or even 4400. So that would be like a cheap memory option that would make sense on X570, but I don't know. I wouldn't go for it. Because like the other thing is that high memory speeds, like high memory speeds are just such a pain in many situations. It's like I generally would recommend, like, it's nice when they work properly, but they're not reliable in my experience. Like they generally, it's like if you want problems, the way you get problems is you go for high memory frequency. That's how you get problems. So, and the other thing is high memory speeds generally don't play well with high memory density. So like on 32 gigs of RAM, these speeds might be actually pretty problematic. But I don't know. But that's just my suspicion. So so if you're planning some kind of more exotic build with some more exotic requirements, like a lot of RAM or something like that, or high memory speed, I would actually say you should just wait for motherboard reviews to come out. Which actually, I don't know anybody who does that intense memory testing. So you might be screwed in that department, and you'll just have to, play, just take a leap of faith and hope that the motherboard you picked up has good memory support for whatever memory configuration you decide to run. But anyway, because your other option is to wait for me to put out memory performance, like memory overclocking reviews, and we all know how quickly I get around to doing anything. So, yeah, but initially, if you're not going for stupid high memory speeds, I don't see a point in X570. If you're not going for a high core count, I don't see the point in the X570 VRM. And if you're not going for a bunch of PCIe 4.0 SSDs, I don't see a point in X570's PCIe 4.0. At which point, I'd say, yeah, you can just go buy yourself a B450 board. And if you already have a B450 or a X470 motherboard, I'd say a good option is like the thing is, nothing is stopping you from buying the CPU first, right? Upgrading your motherboard BIOS, and then waiting for reviews of X570 motherboards, and then buying the best X570 motherboard you can, instead of like rushing out day one, buying some X570 motherboard, and then finding out that, something on it is horribly broken. For like, that shouldn't happen, but I'd say every generation, there's like one or two motherboards where something is just wrong completely from one vendor or another. Like say Asus with the X370-Pro, I think that board was like freaking awful from what I've heard. And I just ripped on Asus. So as a counter, I can't remember which ASRock boards that were even worse. Like ASRock had a pair of motherboards that used the same PCB that were even worse for memory overclocking. Like they were super bad. They canceled them eventually, but I can't remember the names. So, yeah. And so that's kind of that. And then, and then I'd say, a lot of people are asking me about, hey, what about like buying a high-end X470 motherboard instead of a mid-range or low-end X570 motherboard? And I'd say in that case, choose very carefully, because the X570 boards, in terms of just raw build quality, massive upgrades across the board, like much bigger, better VRMs. It's funny how that works. Bigger, well, no, there's there's the ITX board from Gigabyte. That VRM isn't bigger and still a lot better than what you get on a lot of the full ATX X470 boards. Though admittedly those wouldn't be high end at that point. But whatever. But yeah, you can get much better VRMs. You know, better memory support. Potentially similar or better IO. You'll have to like, that's the part that I would like look into in detail, right? Check out the IO section, see if you like that, if you care that, you know, there's enough USB ports or whatever. But I wouldn't like, I wouldn't right now make like immediate motherboard decisions, right? And if you're just doing like, and if you don't know, like I'd argue at the same time, if you don't know why you need X570, you probably don't need X570. Right? Unless you're doing a 12 core or a 16 core, you don't need a better VRM. You don't, if you're running an, 2080 Ti, you need 3.0 and that's kind of it. So 4.0 is irrelevant. And if you're not going up with 3600 megahertz or not going past 3733, which really like, I don't know where the CPUs will top out in terms of that. But, I might turn out to be completely wrong about this, and it actually is hugely beneficial to run some stupid high memory speed on Ryzen third gen, but at the like I still doubt it, because the thing is like the reason the 2-to-1 mode and 1-to-1 mode here, that's literally like you are underclocking the Infinity Fabric to half its normal speed in order to get the higher memory speeds. So basically at 3600 megahertz over here, right? 3600 CL16, that's 1800 megahertz Infinity Fabric clock. 4000 over here, that's 1000. Like that's an 800 megahertz Infinity Fabric clock difference. So unless you need a ton of bandwidth, which I'd say, like, honestly, the Infinity Fabric clock should impact bandwidth a lot as well. Like, I really wonder how the performance scaling works out, because if the Infinity Fabric's bandwidth is linear with frequency, you are screwed if it goes down by 800 megahertz. Like, that's not something you regain before, you'd be at like 7,200 megahertz memory clock before you got the same Infinity Fabric clock on the 2-to-1 ratio. So I really wonder about how this works out, because at the lower memory speeds, like at 3866, I would not be surprised if you straight up had worse performance all the time in every workload, because the Infinity Fabric is now running just so damn slow. And then at like 4000 or something, it's like, it maybe, well, no, it's still really slow. And then at 4266, it might start, getting somewhere. 4400, okay. But, yeah, like this right here is just like, I'm not sure. Like, are they actually like will it actually perform well? Because because the thing is, the Infinity Fabric ultimately is what connects the memory controller to the CPU cores, right? So it's like, it's great that the data gets from the memory to the memory controller really fast. Now it just needs to get to the cores, and if that takes forever, then who cares that the first part of that transfer was really quick, right? Like that's kind of the thing. So we'll have to, like, I can't wait to see like performance testing on that. I hope I'll be doing performance testing on that, right? Hopefully, assuming I get actually. Oh wait, I'm not gonna be. Oh right, that is a thing. I'm not gonna be here, so I'm not. Yeah, at launch, there's no way I'm testing any of this because I'm not even gonna be around to do it. I'll be busy testing other things. But, yeah, anyway, oh my god, this video is long again. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid, but I guess, it's me. I just can't help myself, but no, I can't help myself when it comes to, like, shutting up. And, well, not shutting up. But yeah, that's my thoughts on X570. Basically, doesn't necessarily make, like, you don't need X570. You could benefit from X570. But you definitely don't need it. I can't see anything that's like, oh my god, X570 is is the best thing ever, because, like, it isn't. It's a chipset. Your CPU is gonna perform performance is gonna be exactly the same on like an X470 board, unless there's some big memory overclocking difference between X470 and X570. So, or a B450 board for that matter, because again, it's a chipset. Like, do you know what the whole point of the chipset is? CPU lives there, chipset lives over there. Chipset takes care of things like SATA ports, USB ports, this PCIe slot down here that nobody cares about, some of your USB ports on the rear IO. You know, that's chipset's job. It has no impact on the CPU. CPU couldn't care less if, like, actually with Ryzen, it would, like, Ryzen being a system on a chip would technically work just fine without a chipset whatsoever. If AMD felt inclined to do motherboards with no chipset. That would be really cool as like a super low cost option. Like a B500 series motherboard with no chipset at all. Just like only use the system on a chip portion of Ryzen itself. Because that would save so much cost. Like the chipsets are like a couple dollars. And actually the X570 one, as far as I know, is like $40-ish is what I've heard from... Or at least from, I think Gamers Nexus said it, that it's around $40. So yeah, if you just threw out the chipset completely, that's like $40 worth of, cost savings. And you still have your main X16 PCIe slot for something like an ITX board. That's all you need. And actually, you still have, I think there's like 4 lanes dedicated to PCI NVMe drives, I think. Because you have 16 plus 4 right here. So yeah, you'd still have like a M.2 slot as well. And you'd be gold. You'd still have some SATA ports, I think. Yeah, I don't even know why didn't they do a non-chipset option? Like, I think that would be really cool. Just like a big VRM, no chipset, great memory layout, right? Just totally strip the board to like basically nothing. That'd be really cool because... Yeah, if you don't need all the extra stuff the chipset adds, of course. Anyway, so yeah, that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Sorry for the like not rethinking this and actually deciding to upload this. But anyway, if you thought this wasn't completely terrible, you can support my channel with Patreon and like Teespring. There's like shirts and stickers and posters on Teespring. So a bunch of merch. You can find a link to that down in the description below. And then there's Patreon if you don't like buying random stuff, right? Like shirts and stickers and whatever. So yeah, that exists as well. And I think that's it for the video. So I should press the stop button. I actually feel like passing out at my desk at this point. So I've achieved the whole like I want to sleep part. Good job, me. See ya.